Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller Sr. by Ron Chernow. Picture this, a frail old man lounging in his mansion, late 70s, the richest person who'd ever walked the planet. For months now, he's been sitting through the strangest therapy sessions imaginable. His biographer reads aloud the most vicious attacks ever written about him, and he, John D. Rockefeller Sr., finally gets to respond, line by line. He sits there eerily calm as his chief accuser's words fill the air. The journalist Ida Tarbell spares no detail about his ruthless business moves, his backdoor deals, how he crushed competitors like insects. The old man, completely serene. His conscience, crystal clear. In his mind, God himself had blessed every decision he'd made. But then, his biographer reads one particular line. It's not even about his business empire. It's about his father, a man who'd been dead for years, a man wrapped in shadows and secrets. Tarbell writes that his father, William Avery Rockefeller, had every vice except one: he never touched alcohol. And just like that, the richest man in history completely loses it. He rockets out of his chair, face burning red, eyes blazing with a fire nobody had ever witnessed. "What a wretched utterance from someone calling herself a historian," he shouts, his voice echoing off the walls. He goes off about this poison woman with her poison tongue, his famous ice-cold composure melting like snow in July. So here's the million-dollar question: why? Why did this single jab at his long-dead father pierce through armor that had withstood attacks from presidents and the hatred of millions? The answer to that question? It's the secret decoder ring to understanding one of history's most fascinating, controversial, and monumentally important figures. And today, we're going to crack that code wide open. We're diving headfirst into Ron Chernow's masterpiece, Titan, a book that sold millions of copies and earned its reputation as the ultimate biography of John D. Rockefeller Sr. By the time we're done, you won't just understand how Rockefeller built the most staggering fortune in modern history. You'll understand the hidden psychological forces driving him forward. You'll see past the myth to the real man, someone who was part saint, part sinner, whose life is basically a masterclass in ambition, control, faith, and what legacy actually means. To really get John D. Rockefeller, you need to understand he was basically forged in a collision between two completely opposite worlds. Two forces that crashed together during his childhood and battled inside him for his entire life. On one side was his mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller. Imagine the embodiment of piety, discipline, and penny-pinching virtue, a devout Baptist who endured incredible hardship with this quiet, unshakable faith. Her life was orderly, her principles rock solid, and her favorite saying when facing tough decisions was, "We will let it simmer." She drilled into her son that waste leads to want, and that working, saving, and giving weren't just good ideas, they were religious obligations. And then there was his other world. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, known to some as Big Bill, and to others, more ominously, as Devil Bill. Imagine a character straight out of a Paul Bunyan story, nearly 6 feet tall, booming voice, movie star looks, and charm that could melt the hardest heart. The guy could win shooting contests blindfolded, do perfect ventriloquism acts, and traveled around as a so-called botanic physician, selling miracle cures from a wagon. When he'd finally come home after disappearing for months, his pockets would be stuffed with cash, and he'd spin these wild tales of adventure. To young John, his dad was basically a superhero, someone who embodied excitement and limitless possibility. But Devil Bill was hiding something. Actually, he was hiding a lot of somethings. He was a con artist, plain and simple. Those miracle cures, snake oil, those stories, mostly fiction. And his life on the road was basically one giant web of lies. Even his first meeting with Eliza was a scam. He pretended to be a deaf-mute peddler to get her sympathy and access to her moderately wealthy family. The chaos he created became the soundtrack of John's childhood. Devil Bill would vanish for months, leaving Eliza and the kids to survive on credit at the local store, never knowing if he'd ever come back. The family lived in this constant state of uncertainty, swinging wildly between anxious poverty and the sudden, brief wealth that came with Bill's returns. But the deepest shame stayed hidden from the children for years. Shortly after marrying Eliza, Bill actually moved his mistress, Nancy Brown, into their tiny home as a supposed housekeeper. He then proceeded to have children with both his wife and his mistress, under the same roof. John Davison Rockefeller, named after his respectable and upright grandfather, was born into this household soaked in scandal, sandwiched between two illegitimate half-sisters. And it kept getting worse. Bill was indicted for rape in 1849, forcing the family to flee town under a cloud of shame. Later, he'd lead a full double life, marrying a second younger woman named Margaret Allen, while still married to Eliza. He became a bigamist, living under the fake name Dr. William Livingston, a name he'd carry to his unmarked grave. This was the fire that forged John D. Rockefeller. On one side, the godliness, order, and stability of his mother. On the other, the chaos, shame, and lawlessness of his father. He loved them both. And he'd spend his entire life trying to reconcile these two warring halves battling inside him. He inherited his father's boldness and grand vision, his instinct for schemes and big plays. But he channeled every bit of it through his mother's iron-willed discipline. He became obsessed with control. He learned to be quiet, secretive, and deeply suspicious of strangers. He developed an almost visceral hatred for disorder, for anything unpredictable, for anything that reminded him of his father's chaotic world. While other boys dreamed of adventure, John dreamed of balanced books. Numbers became his salvation. They were clean, rational, and honest. Numbers couldn't lie to you. At just 7 years old, he started his first business venture, raising and selling turkeys. He kept this small red book, which he called Ledger A, and in it, he meticulously recorded every single penny earned and spent. This ledger became basically sacred to him. It was way more than accounting. It was a moral code. It was his way of forcing perfect, mathematical order onto a messy, unpredictable world. It was his first small rebellion against the chaos of Devil Bill. That obsession with order drove him when, at 16, he launched his legendary hunt for his first real job in Cleveland in 1855. For 6 straight weeks, 6 days a week, he put on his only dark suit and made the rounds of the city's biggest businesses, the railroads, the banks, the wholesale merchants. He wasn't just looking for any old job. As he said, "I was after something big." He faced rejection after rejection, but he never got discouraged. He treated the job hunt itself like a business, and he was its sole, determined employee. Finally, on September 26, 1855, a day he'd celebrate for the rest of his life as Job Day, he got hired as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a commission merchant firm. For Rockefeller, this wasn't just employment, it was an answered prayer. He was finally free. Free from his unpredictable father, free from the endless moving around, free from the shame and uncertainty that had defined his childhood. He threw himself into the work with religious intensity. "The world of commerce," he said, "was delightful to me, all the method and system of the office." He saw ledgers as sacred texts revealing hidden truths. He attacked every bill with a zealot's intensity, catching errors of even a few cents. He built a reputation as a young man who was unnervingly precise, methodical, and reliable. While other young guys chased pleasure, Rockefeller chased perfection in his work. He was building an internal fortress of discipline and order, one meticulous brick at a time. But just as he was escaping his father's chaos, he was about to get pulled into a new kind of chaos, a wild, lawless frontier that would make Devil Bill's world look downright tame. In 1859, a former railroad conductor named Colonel Edwin Drake drilled a well in a remote corner of western Pennsylvania and struck oil. It triggered this absolute frenzy, a black gold rush every bit as insane as the California gold rush a decade earlier. Fortune seekers flooded the region, a place that quickly earned the nickname Sodom Gomorrah. The oil fields were a scene of breathtaking disorder. Derricks sprouted everywhere like weeds, speculators scrambled over greasy slopes, and boomtowns appeared and vanished overnight. There were no rules, no systems, only this frantic, helter-skelter scramble for riches. In other words, everything John D. Rockefeller hated. Rockefeller, by then a young and successful produce merchant in Cleveland, didn't rush headlong into oil. He studied it. He saw an industry plagued by the exact wild speculation and destructive competition that he believed were the enemies of sound business. Prices swung violently from 10 cents a barrel to $10 a barrel in a single year. Refiners entered the business with tiny investments, hoping to strike it rich quick, only to go bankrupt when the market shifted. To Rockefeller, it was just another sinking ship, another example of the chaos he'd spent his life trying to escape. But where others saw a gamble, Rockefeller saw a grand opportunity, not just to get rich, but to impose order. He believed God had put that oil in the ground for a purpose, to provide the world with cheap light. And he began to believe that he, John D. Rockefeller, had been chosen for a special mission, to tame this wild industry and bring it under rational control. In 1863, at just 24, he and a partner, Maurice Clark, backed a self-taught chemist named Samuel Andrews and opened a small oil refinery in Cleveland called the Excelsior Works. This was Rockefeller's entry into the business, not as some wildcatter drilling for oil, but as a refiner, a middleman, a processor. It was a calculated choice. Drilling was basically a lottery. Refining, in Rockefeller's hands, could become a science. From this small refinery, he began executing the strategy that would make him master of the oil world. The foundation principle was beautifully simple: economies of scale. He believed that by creating the largest, most efficient operation, he could drive costs down to a point where nobody could compete. As he later said, the idea was that the larger the volume, the better the opportunities for the economies. He started applying his mother's thrift on an industrial scale. He built his own barrels for less than half the going rate. He hired his own plumbers and bought his own pipes. He found ways to sell the waste products from refining gasoline, paraffin, petroleum jelly, turning garbage into gold. Every single step of the process was studied, analyzed, and optimized to squeeze out another fraction of a cent in savings. Soon, his refining business was more profitable than his produce commission house. But his ambition wasn't just to be the most profitable refiner. It was to be the only refiner. The chaos of competition still tormented him. He saw it as wasteful, irrational, and frankly unchristian. He had this vision of a new kind of business, a great cooperative that would bring all refiners together, end the destructive price wars, and stabilize the industry for everyone's good. This vision, which he called our plan, was beautiful and benevolent in his own mind. In the real world, its execution was absolutely brutal. In 1870, he incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with $1 million in capital, making it one of the largest corporations in the country. And then he began his conquest. The first target was his own backyard, the 26 rival refineries in Cleveland. In what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller, over a 6-week period in early 1872, swallowed up 22 of his competitors. His method was this stunning display of strategic brilliance and psychological warfare. He'd approach a rival and, in his soft, melodious, almost preacher-like voice, lay out the grim reality. The industry was in ruins. Only by combining forces could they save themselves. He'd then make an offer. Sell your refinery to me for a fair price, payable in either cash or Standard Oil stock. Take the stock, he'd urge them. It'll be good for you. But behind this gentle persuasion was an iron fist. Rockefeller had forged a secret alliance with the major railroads, a cartel called the South Improvement Company. This deal gave Standard Oil massive, secret rebates on its freight costs. Even more devastating, it gave them drawbacks, a fee for every barrel of oil shipped by their competitors. It meant that every time a rival made a sale, they were unknowingly paying tribute to Rockefeller. It was a weapon of almost unparalleled cruelty. The threat was clear, even if unspoken: join me or be crushed. Most refiners, seeing the writing on the wall, sold out. Some took the cash and disappeared. Those who took the stock became fantastically wealthy, partners in the very monopoly they once fought. Rockefeller saw this not as a hostile takeover, but as an act of mercy. He was like Moses, leading his competitors out of the desert of competition. The standard, he said, was an angel of mercy reaching down from the sky and saying, "Get into the ark." His vanquished rivals, however, didn't see an angel. They saw a monster. They saw a man who'd used secret deals and brute force to destroy them. The Cleveland Massacre was the original sin from which all of Rockefeller's other alleged crimes would spring. It made him the most powerful refiner in the world, but it also made him a pariah in the oil regions, a figure of hatred and fear. From Cleveland, the conquest rolled on. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, the oil regions themselves. One by one, the major refining centers fell under Standard Oil's control. Rockefeller absorbed hundreds of companies, often keeping their original names to create this network of bogus independence that gave the illusion of competition while secretly taking orders from 26 Broadway in New York. His intelligence network was legendary. He had spies everywhere collecting data on every barrel of oil sold by competitors. He was the master puppeteer, pulling invisible strings that controlled an entire industry. By the early 1880s, his dream of order was nearly complete. To formalize his control, his lawyer, Samuel C.T. Dodd, devised this ingenious new legal structure, the trust. Shareholders of 40 different companies turned their stock over to a board of 9 trustees, including John and his brother William. In return, they received trust certificates, which entitled them to a share of the profits of the entire combination. The Standard Oil Trust, created in 1882, was the first great trust in American history. It was a holding company that allowed Rockefeller to centrally manage this vast, sprawling empire as if it were a single entity. By the end of the decade, Standard Oil controlled nearly 90% of the oil refined in the United States. It owned the pipelines, the tank cars, the storage facilities. It set prices, dictated terms to the railroads, and crushed any competitor who dared challenge its dominance. John D. Rockefeller, the quiet boy from upstate New York who'd been haunted by chaos, had become the absolute monarch of a global empire. He'd imposed his will upon an industry, creating a machine of breathtaking efficiency and power. He wasn't even 50 yet. The rest of the world, however, was just beginning to wake up to what he'd built, and the backlash, when it came, would be absolutely ferocious. Just as Rockefeller reached the peak of his power, a new kind of journalism was emerging, one dedicated to exposing the dark underbelly of American life. These reporters, whom Teddy Roosevelt would later call muckrakers, saw men like Rockefeller not as captains of industry, but as robber barons. The first major shot was fired in 1881 by Henry Demarest Lloyd in the Atlantic Monthly, but the full-scale war began in November 1902, when McClure's magazine started publishing a series of articles by a journalist named Ida Minerva Tarbell. Tarbell wasn't some outsider looking in. She'd grown up in the heart of the Pennsylvania oil regions. Her father was an independent oil producer, one of the very men who'd been squeezed by Rockefeller's relentless consolidation. She'd seen firsthand the fear and hatred that Standard Oil inspired. For her, this wasn't just a story. It was a personal crusade. For 19 months, Tarbell laid out the entire sordid history of Standard Oil for a captivated national audience. She documented the secret deals, the railroad rebates, the industrial espionage, the predatory pricing. She told the story of the Cleveland Massacre and the Widow Bacchus. She wrote with this cool clinical precision that somehow made the revelations even more damning. The series was a sensation. It transformed Rockefeller from an obscure, shadowy figure into the most hated man in America. He became the symbol of everything wrong with the new industrial order: the greed, the ruthlessness, the contempt for ordinary people. The press had a new name for his company, the Octopus. Rockefeller's response to this onslaught was a masterful display of silence. He believed that answering his critics would only give their lies dignity. Let the world wag, was his attitude. He was confident that history would vindicate him. But his silence got misinterpreted as arrogance, as basically admitting guilt. The political tide was turning. The public was demanding action against the trusts. And in the White House was a man who knew exactly how to ride waves of popular opinion: Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt saw Standard Oil as the quintessential bad trust, and, armed with Tarbell's investigation, he unleashed the full power of the federal government against it. In November 1906, the government filed this massive antitrust suit against Standard Oil, charging it with conspiracy to restrain trade and seeking its complete dissolution. The legal battles that followed were epic. For years, Rockefeller became the world's richest fugitive, dodging subpoenas and hiding out on his vast estates. When he was finally forced to testify, he was a master of evasion, playing the sweet, forgetful old man who couldn't seem to remember a thing about the business he'd built. But the evidence was overwhelming. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court handed down its verdict. Standard Oil was found guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act and was ordered to be broken up. The Great Trust, the creation that had been Rockefeller's life's work, the monument he'd built to the principle of order, was to be dismantled. When the news reached him, Rockefeller was on the golf course at his Pocantico estate. He read the telegram, showed zero emotion, and then turned to his golfing partner. "Shall we go on, gentlemen?" he asked. It seemed like the final, crushing defeat, the end of an empire. But the story of John D. Rockefeller is never that simple. The breakup of Standard Oil, the act that was meant to be his punishment, turned out to be the single most profitable event of his entire life. The old trust got dissolved into 34 separate companies. As a shareholder of the parent company, Rockefeller received a proportionate stake in each of the new entities. And as the age of the automobile dawned, the value of these companies absolutely exploded. The stock of Standard Oil of Indiana soared from $3,500 to $9,500 in less than a year. The man who was worth an estimated $300 million at the time of the breakup was worth nearly $900 million just 2 years later. The government, in trying to slay the dragon, had only succeeded in creating a whole bunch of smaller, fantastically profitable dragons, and Rockefeller owned a piece of them all. He'd already retired from day-to-day management of Standard Oil in the mid-1890s, turning the reins over to his fiery protege John D. Archbold. His health had begun to fail, and he suffered from this strange digestive malady and a condition called alopecia, which caused him to lose all his hair, including his eyebrows and eyelashes, giving him that haunting, almost mummified appearance that became his public image. But his retirement wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. It was the start of his second, and perhaps even more astonishing, career. Rockefeller had always believed it was his religious duty not just to make money, but to give it away. "God gave me my money," he said, and he saw himself as a trustee, a steward of that divine gift. Now, with a fortune rolling up like an avalanche, as his chief philanthropic advisor Frederick T. Gates put it, he faced a new challenge: how to give away money on a scale the world had never seen, and to do it wisely. He approached philanthropy with the same systematic, visionary mindset he'd brought to business. He didn't want to just give handouts to the poor. He wanted to attack the root causes of human misery. He called it wholesale philanthropy. He created institutions that would, in their own way, be as revolutionary as Standard Oil. He founded the University of Chicago, transforming a struggling Baptist college into a world-class university almost overnight by raiding the faculties of Harvard and Yale. He poured millions into it, creating this great center of learning and research in the heart of the Midwest. In 1901, he founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the first institution in America devoted solely to biomedical research. He hired the brilliant Dr. Simon Flexner to run it, and the institute went on to produce a string of Nobel laureates and medical breakthroughs, from a cure for spinal meningitis to the development of a yellow fever vaccine. He created the General Education Board, which launched this massive campaign to eradicate hookworm in the South, a disease that had afflicted millions and was mistaken for simple laziness. The campaign was a spectacular success, freeing an entire region from a debilitating plague. And in 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation, with a mission that was as simple as it was audacious: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. It would become the largest and most influential philanthropic organization on earth. The man who'd been reviled as a monster was now being hailed as a saint. The transformation was slow, but undeniable. In his old age, he became this beloved, almost mythical figure, the wizened old guy in his golf knickers, handing out shiny new dimes to children and telling them to save their money. He was Neighbor John, the kindly old gentleman who sang hymns at church and loved a good joke. He lived to be almost 98 years old, outlasting his critics, his partners, and even his own dark reputation. When he died in 1937, the obituaries focused not on the robber baron, but on the philanthropist. But the contradictions remained, and they got passed down to his only son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Jr. was everything his grandfather, Devil Bill, wasn't. He was serious, dutiful, and consumed by this sense of moral responsibility. He'd grown up in the shadow of his father's infamy, and he dedicated his life to cleansing the family name. He was the one who had to confront the dark legacy of Standard Oil, most painfully during the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, when striking miners and their families were killed at a Colorado coal mine owned by the family. That event was a brutal awakening for Jr. It forced him to break from his father's hardline anti-union stance and pioneer new forms of industrial relations. It was Jr. who would build Rockefeller Center, restore colonial Williamsburg, and create the national parks at Acadia and the Grand Tetons. He was the steward, the conscience of the family, the man who turned the Rockefeller fortune into a permanent force for public good. But he could never fully escape the shadow of his father. Just as John D. Sr. was haunted by Devil Bill, Jr. was haunted by the towering, enigmatic figure of Sr. It was a dynasty built on a profound and enduring contradiction. When you close a book like Titan, you're left with this sense of awe, not just at the scale of Rockefeller's fortune, but at the sheer force of his will. Here was a man who, from the humblest and most chaotic of beginnings, imposed an astonishing degree of order on the world around him. And I think that's the first great lesson we can pull from his life. Rockefeller wasn't just a businessman, he was an architect of systems. While his competitors were gambling on drilling the next great well, he was methodically building a machine, an integrated system of refining, transport, and marketing that made him immune to the gamble. He understood a principle that's absolutely crucial for anyone with big ambitions. Goals are temporary, but systems are permanent. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. His goal wasn't just to be rich. His system was to create a business so efficient, so dominant, that wealth was the inevitable result. Think about that in your own life. What's one area where you feel like you're constantly struggling, where things feel chaotic and unpredictable? Your studies, your health, your finances. Instead of just setting another goal, ask yourself, what system could I build that would make success the natural outcome? Rockefeller started with a simple ledger book, a system for tracking every penny. It seems small, but it was the foundation of everything that followed. The second lesson is about the power of a quiet mind. Rockefeller was surrounded by blustering, loud, aggressive men, the railroad barons, the wildcatters, his own father. But he cultivated silence. He listened way more than he spoke. He let his opponents exhaust themselves with anger, while he sat calmly, thinking, planning. In a world that prizes noise and speed, Rockefeller teaches us that true power often lies in patience, in deliberation, in the ability to keep your own counsel while others lose their heads. As he once said, success comes from keeping the ears open and the mouth closed. But the most profound, and perhaps most difficult, lesson from Rockefeller's life is about the nature of legacy. For decades, his legacy was one of ruthless greed. He was the most hated man in America. Yet today, when we hear the name Rockefeller, we think of medical breakthroughs, of great universities, of national parks. We think of philanthropy on a scale that's still, to this day, breathtaking. Does the good he did in the end wash away the questionable methods he used to acquire his fortune? It's a question without an easy answer. Chernow's book doesn't try to give us one. Instead, it presents us with the full, unvarnished picture of a man who was both a creator and a destroyer. A man who believed he was an instrument of God, even as he engaged in acts that many saw as profoundly unchristian. His life forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that human beings are complex, contradictory creatures. We're capable of immense good and immense harm, sometimes in the very same breath. And perhaps the greatest challenge of life isn't to be perfect, but to find a way to make our good outweigh our bad. To build something that lasts, something that serves others, even if the foundation is laid with imperfect materials. Rockefeller wasn't a saint. He was a deeply flawed, deeply human man who bent the world to his will. But in the end, he also used that same will to leave the world a profoundly better place than he found it. And in that epic 50-year struggle between his two selves, the son of Devil Bill and the son of Eliza, lies a story for the ages. That was a summary of Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller Sr. by Ron Chernow. We've certainly touched on the major themes and stories today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary is just a map. The real journey happens when you explore the territory yourself. The true power of this book is in the rich detail, the nuance, the quiet moments where a story or a quote makes you stop and think about your own life in a new way. This summary is meant to be a starting point, to help you decide if this is a journey you want to take. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity, I can't recommend this book highly enough. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the very DNA of ambition, power, and the complex art of building a legacy. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it gave you something to think about, please do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that we're on the right track, and it ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the Billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.